So I'll start off. I'm Jake Grumbach. I'm moderating this panel at UC Berkeley, and I'll start off by saying it's my expert opinion that the U.S. has slipped to what scholars call competitive authoritarianism, something from consolidated liberal democracy slipped down through a series of signals, starting from a 2021 attempted electoral subversion and coup, and the return of this coalition and leadership, through to an executive branch that has ignored judicial orders on USAID spending and immigration enforcement, the arrest of a judge in the state of Wisconsin by federal forces, Elon Musk and Doge impoundment of congressionally appropriated spending and funds through statutes, violating Article 1 of the U.S. Constitution, the politicization of the civil service and of immigration enforcement in the U.S., more recently sending the Marines and National Guards over the wishes of California's state government to Los Angeles to squash protests. And finally, just today, the Department of Homeland Security handcuffing and arresting U.S. Senator Alex Padilla. All of this signals that the U.S. has moved from what was considered a consolidated liberal democracy with heavy emphasis on minority rule and checks on majoritarianism. But one thing was potentially true about the US system, and that was its checks and balances ostensibly blocked the consolidation of power into any single one of the three branches of government. And that was based on a logic going back to James Madison in Federalist 51 of ambition counteracting ambition. The power and authority of a given office would check the power and authority of another office in the US government, because to consolidate power into one branch would be an attack on the authority of the other branches. And that logic was to sustain the stability of the rule of law in the US, even when the US was not a democracy until the enforcement of the Voting Rights Act after 1965. So Lisa Miller has written a provocative article on these checks and balances in this recent special issue of Boston Review. First, I'm going to turn it over to her for a set of opening remarks. Then we're going to go around to our panelists, Alex Gourevitch, Eric Blanc, and Sam Moyn, for responses around this. So Lisa, please go ahead and kick us off.
Thank you very much, Jake. And thanks again also to the Boston Review for this great issue and this great event. And to my co-panelists, I'm looking forward to a good discussion. So let me start out by saying that in 2016, Hillary Clinton, this is 2016, stated that American checks and balances will protect the US from the disease of authoritarianism. And in 2025, Senator Chuck Schumer echoed these comments, saying that the president is attacking our system of checks and balances, which has served this republic so well for centuries. So I challenge the basic premise of these claims. I don't think doubling down on American checks and balances are an adequate response to our current dangerous political moment. This storied separation of powers system that separates power vertically across national and state governments and horizontally across different branches of government that we call checks and balances doesn't seem to be faring very well in the wake of an administration that is using its authority for personal vendettas to consolidate power and so on, as Jake mentioned. It turns out that elites don't check elites very well. But this checks and balances system wasn't faring very well before either, with respect to democratic processes and political responsiveness. I think urging a return to normal misses the point that the normal order is widely perceived as a problem. So whatever we learned in high school social studies class about American style of checks and balances has some very serious flaws. So I want to briefly offer two insights that I think are missing from our standard civics education and that I hope can help us develop a new path forward and hopefully spark some discussion. First, the American idea of checks and balances is all about constraining what government can do. By separating power into different branches, as Jake said, and across different levels of government won't become too powerful. No one branch will become too powerful, and therefore government won't become too powerful. And to be sure, checks on power are important. Governments wield enormous power, and when that power is used to punish enemies and reward friends, for self-dealing and family enrichment in ways that benefit the haves and harm the have-nots, it's important to have mechanisms to constrain such actions. But focusing exclusively on constraining government misses something very important. People don't just want to constrain government. They want government to do things, mostly things that help them improve their lives. When we restrict ourselves to talking about checking power, we offer people no response to how government should use power to address changing economic conditions, rising healthcare costs, the housing crisis, to address the concentration of private power that has really grown over the past 40 years. Ironically, political systems with many checkpoints, like the United States, have a powerful bias in favor of the preferences of elites, of those with disproportionate economic and political influence, with contacts, connections, wealth, and resources. And it's one of the reasons why the alleged protections of American checks and balances against rising authoritarianism isn't working very well. When elites in control of these institutions are in collusion with rising authoritarians, there's very little this structure can do. But as a result of this complex political structure, it makes it hard to get things done when it's dominated disproportionately by those of privilege. And the consequences are plain to see. The United States lags behind other affluent democracies in some very basic policies, like universal affordable health care, protections against labor market insecurity, paid maternal, family, and medical leave. The United States is the only country of like the top 30 wealthiest democracies in the world, in fact, some not very democracies, that doesn't offer paid maternity leave, that doesn't require, I should say, paid maternity leave. So Americans, the fact that Americans don't get such policies is not because they don't want them. It's because our complex system of checks and balances actually constrains the ability of government to enact even these very basic policy reforms. We then celebrate the obstacle to producing policy in the public interest by saying, well, at least our checks and balances system protects us from democratic erosion and aspiring authoritarians. The other problem is that we often then mistake cause for effect. We don't have these policies, and so we assume people don't want them, when in fact it's very often the institutional structure that keeps us from getting them. So I don't think doubling down on those checks now will solve the problems that led to Trump's election in the first place. Aspiring authoritarians rarely come out of nowhere. Focusing on checking the current administration without a proactive message about what government should do is not enough. Opposition in our current moment needs to have a proactive case for government power in the public interest, but one that is sincere, not platitudes, one that's realistic in this complex political structure. How will we get it done? Not one that's just fantasy, one that speaks to people's everyday needs and that calls out the anti-democratic actions of the current administration. And by anti-democratic, I don't just mean efforts to constrain democratic politics, but efforts to wield government power for private gain and against the public interest. This is the use of government that's for the very, this is using government for the very purposes that democratic governments intended to mitigate. A second problem with the standard checks and balances story is that it smuggles in a lot of contempt for the people. It assumes that governing bodies will check each other, and it's very skeptical of the democratic process as a way of checking power. This is true on both left and right. A lot of political appeals to checks and balances imply that the dangerously misinformed and morally backward mass publics are the prime drivers of authoritarianism, and we need more responsible elite institutions to keep them in check. But I don't think this is a very accurate picture. Americans have long wanted the national government to balance the deeply concentrated economic power of the private sector and the extent to which it links up with the public sector, with public officials, with policies that actually benefit the public. A revitalized mass democratic politics, a majoritarian politics that holds mainstream parties accountable, has the potential to limit the ability of public and private elites to monopolize power, as well as to constrain the extremists that threaten American democracy today. Fortunately, we don't have to reinvent the wheel. US history is filled with examples of political conflicts challenging the institutional status quo. Elite power was a major point of contestation in the early republic, a central cause of the Civil War. It animated Americans as they pursued democratization in the 19th and 20th centuries and motivated some of the most important socioeconomic policies, from the labor movement and women's suffrage to the civil rights movement, poor people's movements, the environmental movement, and it has powered the revival of private sector union organizing in this century, again against plutocratic rule, against unchecked power of multinational corporations and Silicon Valley tech companies. Of course, elites are vital to social movements. In a nod to my co-panelists, identifying and supporting powerful individuals and groups that believe in the public good is essential. And we don't have to reinvent the wheel in another sense, as my other co-panelist discusses. Labor unions probably have the best structural model for how to overcome some of the complexity of American checks and balances. They're organized vertically and horizontally across different bodies of government, and that's a framework that we don't have to invent from scratch. I'll just conclude by saying that rather than celebrating checks and balances that entrench the power of the powerful, I think it's more accurate to say that ordinary Americans have been trying to overcome checks and balances for 200 years. If our aim is to safeguard democracy, these dangerous times call for a long overdue reckoning with our constitutional system's deep vices and a clear vision for overcoming them. Thank you.
Thanks, Lisa. Powerful and provocative. I like to summarize Lisa's argument on the folk wisdom of veneration of the U.S. Constitution as sort of like checks and balances did a really good job of checking majorities, but when there was an insurgent authoritarian, the checks and balances were essentially nowhere to be found. With that argument, let's turn it to Alex Gourevitch next.
Thank you very much. That was a great opening discussion, Lisa. My article for the Boston Review was not directly about the problem of checks and balances, but actually a kind of a response to a parallel problem, which is the most severe crackdown on protests on college campuses in many decades. And it was a response to a facet of that problem, which is that why did universities and the left find it so difficult to develop a coherent and robust defense of the right to protest in the face of these crackdowns? And the answer is complex, but the part of the answer that I focused on is that, for one, generally, there's been an erosion of a principled commitment to free speech and academic freedom. But in particular, the thing that I was most concerned to discuss in the article was that there's been the adoption of certain ideas about harm, harassment, and identity, in the name of which more restrictive attitudes and policies towards speech had emerged, both on and off campus over the previous decades. And these were primarily ideas developed on the left side of the political spectrum, but they were now suddenly being used. They were really the very same kinds of ideas that were then used to justify the crackdowns. And I discuss a number of different aspects of these ideas, but the most important is an idea that's taken hold that in one way or another, members of the university community, or just people more broadly, have a right not to be safe, but to feel safe, which produces an emphasis on the felt experience of harm and oppression, which then affects the many different ways of interpreting the various legal and institutional standards in relation to when speech has crossed an acceptable threshold. So, for example, it meant that if a person feels harmed, then they are harmed. Or if a person finds speech offensive, then that ipso facto kind of counts as harassment. Or if a person feels threatened, then they really are threatened. Or alternatively, and this is featured very heavily recently in a number of the lawsuits as well, is that if a person is triggered, upset, or scared by something that is being said during a protest, such that they don't feel that they can go outside or that they need to avoid what they're exposed to, then that in itself counts as creating a hostile educational environment. Now, on any of these variations of that same kind of argument, the implication is that there's little or no expectation that a member of a university community has to tolerate or endure the speech that they find disturbing or offensive or unnerving. Rather, the implication is that they have a right to call on authorities to act in a way that reduces or assuages their feeling of being harmed, harassed, or discriminated against. Now, I think there's a good reason that this set of arguments came to a head with protests in particular, given what protests are. Because I think they're a distinctive kind of speech and conduct. They are, by definition, and I kind of lay this out in the article, collective disruptive acts in which protesters invariably express hostility towards certain views or policies and the people who support them. Now, if we expect to expunge that element of incivility, hostility, or even aggressiveness from protests, we would just effectively be eliminating protests themselves. But there's a kind of implication that that's the direction we're supposed to head if we adopt the aforementioned arguments about harm and harassment. But if we accept that everyone has a right to protest, then that means it is reasonable, it has to be reasonable, to expect everyone to tolerate the feelings that those protests are going to generate. And that is true whether we're talking about a pro-life protest in which protesters hold up posters with dead fetuses next to Nazi flags and lynched black bodies, in which they call abortion a genocide, which is a real example from the article. Or if it's pro-Israel protesters calling Palestinians terrorists, another real example from the article. Or whether we're talking about pro-Palestinian protesters who are protesting against Israel's mass killing of Palestinians, which was the case in point. But just to conclude, I think to get to a place where we can really then defend the right to protest, we have to kind of restate a number of things have to happen. But at minimum, I think first, universities need to return to their commitment to institutional neutrality with respect to all those moral and political issues not directly related to their academic mission of protecting the academic and intellectual freedom of their members. And second, we need a more absolute defense of free speech, including the right to protest in particular, which means holding ourselves and everyone else to the expectation that, as adults at a university, they and we ought to endure speech and conduct that we might nonetheless find vile, upsetting, or unsettling. And that we can't expect that a proper response to the kinds of feelings and reactions we have to that speech is to ask authorities to intervene on our or on your behalf. So that's the argument of the article. I apologize, I won't be able to stay for this whole book launch event. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Alex. Just hitting two critically important things. First, the role of protest within democracies, including as a bulwark against authoritarianism from mass publics. First, and second, thinking about institutions within liberal society, universities being a key one, others being large firms, lawyers and judges, religious organizations, but in civil society, universities loom large within liberal democracies. And the notion there that university politics actually tells us and gauges us on where we are in democracy and authoritarianism. Thanks for that. Let's turn to Eric Blanc, labor historian from Rutgers. Go ahead, Eric.
Yeah, thanks, Lisa, Alex, Jake, everybody, Boston Review. Yeah, it's great to be here. The argument I made in the response I wrote to Lisa was basically to agree and to ask the question of, well, how do we actually get working people to care about this? And that's less obvious than it might seem. I started with an anecdote, which is still, even though it was written, maybe 2 months ago now, is still very much the case, which is that most unions have stuck with an approach that leans almost entirely strategically on checks and balances, which is to say that they're just focused on litigation to stop Trump. I've mostly been focused my organizing since Trump got elected on the federal sector. I'm working with the Federal Unionist Network. And that's had to emerge in part because these unions, and these are big unions representing over 2 million workers, have responded to the most brutal attack against public services on a national level in US history, and arguably the worst attack on the labor movement in US history, as far as sheer numbers of workers who were overnight denied the right to collectively bargain. Trump's executive order attempted to do that for over 1 million workers. Similarly, the security workers at the airports were just overnight denied the right to collectively bargain. And so in the face of that, one might expect that the labor movement, which at least famously, historically, and still occasionally today, has disruptive power would lean on some of that disruptive power to challenge, or at least threaten to leverage this disruptive power to challenge is an authoritarian coup. And nevertheless, not only has that not happened, but there hasn't even been a threat of that happening. And that's the nicest way to say that's extremely troubling. Because the implications are not just that if you can destroy the federal workers' unions and that movement, that A, will create space for Trump to be able to use the whole apparatus to go after everybody else. But then also every employer in the country will take advantage of this moment of just trying to take on the federal unions and do PATCO on steroids. So the stakes are very high, and this approach of leaning on litigation, while I think we should acknowledge it has slowed down some of the worst attacks. And it is true that is the case, and that's bought more time for organizing. So I don't think we should, can entirely discard that, but it's just totally insufficient. Okay, so the question though that I try to focus on in the piece is, well, how do we get working people to care about this? And that's hard because, frankly, it's hard enough to organize workers, even when it's a deeply felt and widely felt issue. So this is the dilemma we face in building a union or trying to get mass protests around these issues. Is that even when people really want to see change, there's collective action problems and a sense of resignation is the norm. And getting large numbers of workers, because there's always exceptions, but getting large numbers of workers to take action, even around the issues that they feel most deeply about, takes a lot of work, takes a lot of effort, and it's not always easy to scale up. Frankly, it's mostly very difficult to scale up. So in that context, I think it's worth emphasizing that the most likely path towards getting large numbers of workers to care about constitutional reform is out of movements that are primarily focused on the most immediate sort of needs that they face. And I think as a general trend in the US and in the world, we can say that, at least in contexts where working people have won formal legal equality, that their overwhelming focus, as far as the most urgent needs, tends to be economic material concerns, because the level of insecurity and exploitation of being in that position in society lends itself to these concerns being predominant in a way that isn't the case for middle class or upper class people, in cases at least where there's legal equality. So what does that look like? It's looked like, to a certain extent, what we've seen in the recent labor uptick, where workers have built unions and fought to build unions and to have a voice at work, to have better wages. And in turn, that has forced them to confront the limitations of existing labor law. And that is a different way of thinking about how you would get working people to care about labor law than the norm has been amongst unions, for instance, in which it was purely a sort of lobbying approach for Congress. And at most, you would educate people about the need for labor law reform. So maybe write a letter to your congressperson. The problem is most people that just, if you're struggling to survive and you're trying to get by, this is at a level of abstraction, frankly, that doesn't resonate widely enough and deeply enough for people to take action around that. And so I do think that the crucial question for us is going to be, how do we help get millions of workers in motion around today, fighting, for instance, to save Medicaid, for fighting to save Social Security, for fighting to save their right to a union, for fighting to save the agencies that are getting destroyed by these cuts in the federal sector. And that's not to say we shouldn't be fighting, for instance, for undocumented workers who don't have legal equality and are being subjected to Gestapo techniques. We shouldn't counterpose these. But if we're thinking realistically and strategically and hard-headedly about what's going to take to get large numbers of workers in motion, in a place where then we can raise the question of what it would take to win our demands, which raises all of the questions of constitutional reform that Lisa raises, I think that's going to be through the process of these fights around immediate issues. I'll leave it at that.
Excellent, Eric. Thanks so much. First on labor militancy of tactics and choices, the use of strike and other disruptive tactics versus legalism, and then secondarily, how are workers organized around their interests and how to organize them into a coalition that robustly stands for democracy and its expansion. Sam.
Hey, everyone. To begin with, congratulations to Boston Review on its anniversary, and props to Lisa on an excellent article. The truth is that when I was asked to respond, I tried to get out of it simply because I fully agree with everything Lisa said. They made me do it anyway. And so what I tried to do was kind of pivot. I'm in a teaching field, at least constitutional law, where Lisa's piece is of great value, very articulate, very elegant, in refuting the kind of core propositions that all of my colleagues hold, namely that a counter-majoritarian institution, the Supreme Court, is essential to define democracy and for its proper functioning, and maybe counter-majoritarian elites more generally. So those of us who've been resisting that view have a great ally in Lisa. Still, there's this question, I think, if not elites checking elites, then what? And my short response is just a series of queries about, well, what does majoritarianism mean exactly? One question I ask concerns assuming you don't want a populist president or executive running wild, how do you make the legislature great again? One of the greatest lessons of Donald Trump's current term is how supine Congress is, but the truth is it's been that way for a while. And I don't know anyone who knows how to revive it. And yet calling for majoritarianism presupposes a plan to do so. It's true I mention elites just out of fealty as an outsider and rando to Jake and Lisa's field of political science, to the first lesson that the founders of modern political science taught, which is that elites are an inevitability. Roberto Mikel's Political Parties shows even the greatest Democrats, the socialists, will find their elites. And so my question for Lisa on that front is just if we don't think elites will check elites, how do we indenture elites to a popular project without pretending that we don't need them or they'll just disappear, which is unlikely. Finally, I worry slightly that an attack on checks and balances without, let's say, a substantive content to the vision that that majorities should want, although I think Lisa has very clear ideas about that, could, in a sense, repeat the proceduralism of the checks and balances stands. So I'll just close by saying, Donald Trump was a minority rule president first time around, but he won a plurality of the votes the second time around, certainly more than Kamala Harris. And so for what our system is worth, he came into office as a majoritarian. Obviously, he's lost a lot of energy, and yet, if we don't like where he's going, we can't just content ourselves with the destruction of the checks and balances resistance. We need a Democratic Party or some other party that can incarnate a new majoritarian project. And while Trump is in power, I really like Eric's ideas about protest and obviously Alex's essay on the subject. But I think we should always engage in, with Jake's research on history in mind, and a risk assessment. And you can't deny just what we've seen, that protests lead to predictable responses on the part of authoritarian power. The attack on universities with which Trump entered his term, and crackdowns on street protest. And it's for this reason, I think, that we have to, spend a little time in the shoes of our liberal friends in order to try to refute them, because they're looking at a world in which, I think, contrary to what Jake said at the beginning, judges have been the main bulwark of an obstruction to Trump for a few months. Now, I think that's all a short-term illusion, but it's something that's a real fact, and we're always comparing responses, that we have judges to protests, and I think that's what we need to think hard about in this period going forward, because neither of these strategies is going to go away. They're probably going to be interactive, And the interesting thing to watch, I think, is which gains credibility as Trump responds to both of these threats. Honestly, he seems much rowdier with respect to protests and is kowtowing to a remarkable extent to judges. And that's going to give a whip hand to the liberals kind of leaning into checks and balances, which I think is a problem for all of us in the long term. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Sam. Excellent provocation, and figures that a big city lawyer like you would shout out these judges. So, unlike us, humble public school political scientists over here. But I would like to first turn the mic back to Lisa to respond to these excellent sort of discussions and provocations from the co-panelists. Then I'll have a couple of questions for the entire group, and then we'll turn it over to audience Q&A. So go ahead, Lisa.
Thank you so much. Yeah, and thank you for these fantastic comments and fantastic responses. I mean, let me just start. I'll just go in reverse order. Sam, I agree, and actually, I think Eric's points are tied in here as well. A substantive agenda is essential. And actually, some of the examples I give in the article about, reformers during the labor movement or early labor movement, late 19th century or Reconstruction or civil rights, their vision wasn't institutional reform. Their vision was power, right? And but they recognized that institutional reform was a necessary component of achieving that power. But you're absolutely right that a substantive vision is essential. And I'm trying to stay in my lane as a scholar. I don't know what the right messages are from a political standpoint. I don't know what, I think many places at once is good, but I don't want to, sort of speculate. But I agree very much with that. And I also agree that courts and obviously Congress, if it discovers itself again, are important, absolutely, especially a legislative body. Although, as you point out, Sam, right now it's really courts that are, of the institutions, really the only one we really see doing much checking of the federal courts. I agree. I don't think it's going to, in the long run, I think we know from other research, they can only hold on for so long. And I think, but I agree with you that it's an important check. And I think thinking about institutional reform in ways that bolster how courts can serve, basic constitutional ends of protecting democratic processes, while also constraining, the way they end up checking majoritarians, majoritarian policy preferences and other ways. It should be on the agenda as well. I also want to say, I think in response to Eric, I very much agree. I think that the aim has to be something concrete. But it's also interesting that I think, as I understand unions, and I don't study unions, but unions are fantastic educators, right? Like there's a mechanism of disseminating information about how power works that unions have been very effective at. There's some good research on this, including from one of my former graduate students, about union political knowledge in union households. So you didn't even have to be a union member, but if you were raised in a union household, there were things you understood about the political process. So I also think unions could take on some of this. Obviously the concrete organizing mechanism has to be material, but there's a way in which unions might also serve to help Americans understand why they don't get the things that are so basic and fundamental and relatively easy to do. Like I mentioned, paid maternity and paternity leave, right? Very simple. So I think that's a potentially a useful way of thinking about the intersection of sort of what you and I are talking about. And Alex, I absolutely loved your piece and what you said, and I think the one sort of interesting area of intersection, it's not a perfect fit, but I really think that one really interesting thing is the way the left is also implicated, and liberals are also implicated in some of these problems. Sam, you mentioned the sort of law school mantra, right, of counter-majoritarianism, and of course, plenty of conservatives in law schools, but it's very much been a left of center message for decades that the public is dangerous, the public is dumb, the public doesn't know their material concerns, and if they do, they have no idea who to vote for. They're like a blank slate, and at least just write the script for them. And I'm not naive to all of the ways in which most people don't know very much about politics, but people know their material interests. And when one party is saying, these things are a problem and I'm going to fix them. And one party is saying, actually, everything's fine as long as we don't elect the other guy. People understand that they're going to get more of the same if they stick with the status quo. And I think that was evident in the outcome of the election. But the response from a lot of top Democrats has been sort of worryingly unconcerned about the extent to which the public needs to be mobilized in this moment. And I think it stems a little bit from this sense that the public is the danger, when I really see powerful societal interests as the primary drivers of authoritarian movement. And I think there's some pretty good evidence for that, which doesn't deny the ways in which mass publics can be drawn in. But I think there's a lot of blame to go around here, and I really appreciate, Alex, your comments that I think are exceptionally important.
Thanks, Lisa. I thought that was an excellent response. We unfortunately have to let Alex go. Something incredibly important. But for the rest of the panel, I will also channel Alex a little bit, or attempt to, having read a lot of his work over the years. But I'd like to put back a provocation for this entire group before we turn it over to audience Q&A. Sam earlier sort of steel-manned an institutional liberal response, which is look at judges successfully checking Trump, whereas ordinary people are getting crushed by federal forces in the streets when they try to do so. And that the popular vote went to Trump this time. That's one steel-manned response. An additional one is everybody on the panel has essentially in some way, implicitly or explicitly said, institutions in and of themselves, constitutional institutions, democracy, the rule of law, and so forth, are not valuable in and of themselves, but rather for the outcomes, particularly the material outcomes they bring to people. That has been a sort of a point of agreement, I think, between speakers. But I want to do a steelman opposition to that, which is in this era of smartphone penetration and the internet, in this era of pandemic and post-pandemic world, are material outcomes driving mass politics and institutional politics, or are things much more Gramscian and vibes-based in all sorts of ways? How does one form a coalition around material needs that seems so disconnected particularly in this technological moment? Also, how do you build, how do you counter the argument that majorities often want highly reactionary authoritarian things themselves, and that often dictators in the US and around the world are thrust into power via a populist surge initially? Anybody take it? I'll cold call on you like a law professor if I don't hear it, but before that, I'll let you guys respond.
I can go.
Go ahead, Eric.
So on the material questions and self-honor, I mean, to me, this is actually not so controversial, and it's which is to say that even I would say there seems to be a shift to acknowledge the centrality of economic concerns. That even like liberal pundits, who actually want to pivot maybe back to like third way neoliberal Clintonism would acknowledge, at least on a certain level, that Democrats have been insufficiently focused on sort of, pocketbook issues around the kitchen table issues. And I think it's not just this sense, but just poll after poll shows that the number one concern of people in the last election, the last few elections, has been the economy. And there's actually been a plurality for this, going back decades. It'd be interesting to find the exceptions. I haven't looked at the data recently, but almost in most years, the most salient issue is the economy, which I think has to do with just the basic fact that under capitalism, particularly under neoliberal capitalism, there's a level of insecurity for, you don't have to be destitute, but there's a level of insecurity about how you're going to pay rent and do all of this stuff. What will you do if you lose your job? That just undergirds everything else. And so the more interesting puzzle, I think, is not that this is the case, but that this was so frequently denied by the left and so vigorously argued by the left, oftentimes in the name of social justice issues, which is again somewhat of an inane argument if you think about it, because economic concerns are particularly pressing for racialized populations in this country. So the idea that some economic concerns are not important for people of color, particularly, is frankly like either a bad faith or a very like ill thought through argument. But it is interesting that the extent to which the left hasn't always focused on centering this. Bernie, I think, really more than anybody else is responsible for showing the viability of a different approach. Zoran Mamdani in New York City, I think, is giving another testament to this. But I think we can say honestly that for decades, the left leaned pretty far away from this as a focus, often in the name of social justice, and that was a mistake. And I do think that that reflects and then contributes to a certain class composition um, of the left, which is leaned disproportionately college educated, in which material concerns for the people involved tend to be less salient. And then that gets generalized outwards, and then people who don't see their issues as most important oftentimes get castigated as, you know, racist or backwards, even if the actual reason they voted for Trump was like inflation seemed to be not as bad under Trump, which is for a lot of people just like, you know, that's how they voted. You can agree with it, you can disagree with it, but that's just a very widespread sense. So I think that the bigger issue we have on the left is to absorb more deeply the relative centrality of economics, even than we have to this point.
Thanks. If anyone wants to continue on this answer, also on the institution, go for it, Lisa.
Well, I just want to say, I mean, so let me, you know, what's the phrase? Push back, Jake, at your question a little bit in that, you know, I agree with Eric, and I actually think the focus on, I mean, social media is a problem. In all, I mean, it's, you know, it's a good thing, it's a bad thing, like all technological change, but it's a problem politically in many ways. But I also think there's been an elite perception about the scope of sort of mass publics being absorbed and getting all their news and politics from mass media. A lot of Americans don't pay attention to politics at all, right? In fact, now more than ever are avoiding anything, you know, on their, if they are on social media, which not everybody is, but if they are regularly, you know, just eliminating anything that has to do with anything controversial, political. So I think there's also a sense in which, you know, a lot of chatter happens in social media that is itself very disconnected from the lived experience and the day-to-day lives of large millions and millions of Americans. On the point about, you know, majorities sometimes driving, you know, extremism and right-wing populism. Look, there's no panacea, right? There's no panacea. There's no institutional mechanism invented that can, you know, stop us from doing terrible things to ourselves that I'm aware of. But I do think that when we think about contexts where things go really, really badly, right? And we can all think of many, you know, it's not just mass publics that are implicated. There's a lot of decision making by elites. If they're not the ones really, really starting it and driving it, which I think they usually are, they're making a lot of mistakes along the way, which I think you could say for the Republican Party, actually. And well, both parties did not recognize what was happening. So you know, there's a lot of blame to go around when things go really wrong. I would place more of it with the decisions of elites than of ordinary people.
I'll channel I wrote a popular piece once with Eric Schickler, a political scientist, where historically it is clearly the pattern. The one branch of U.S. government that has not engaged in active democratic backsliding has been Congress, shouting out Sam Moyn and legislative supremacy as an orientation. That the presidency has engaged in some backsliding, but the Supreme Court in extreme ways through Dred Scott, Plessy v. Ferguson, and so forth, it's usually Supreme Court allows new authority of state governments to do new forms of authoritarianism or restrict voting rights or so forth. Congress decides either to step in or not to backstop majoritarianism and popular control of government. That is the pivot, despite its geographic insanity of single-member districts and so forth. Sam, would you like to continue on this point before we turn it over?
Sure. I love this discussion mainly because I agree with everyone. I'll just add, you know, behind Eric's points is the kind of, you know, frighteningly long-term reality of a class de-aligned partisan landscape. Put more simply, there's no working class party, especially transracial working class party. And when it comes to why right-wingers can win, why Donald Trump won, first unfairly within our constitutional system, and just because of the Electoral College, and then fair and square, I think there's a standard answer which proves true, which is that, as August Bebel put it, anti-Semitism is the socialism of fools. And when the Democratic Party refuses to try to put together a transracial working class majority, Republicans can cobble that together their own way. Of course, their intellectuals are making very serious feints in the direction of what would have been called economic progressivism, including some, Bernie bro energy. But, Trump's version is tax cuts plus cultural warfare. And we know that that is working, at least to cement a bare majority or a bare plurality for at the right moment to get into unholy power for enough time. So to me, the onus is on, the Democrats or, some other party to make a good faith effort to build a new working class party. And that's happened before, really twice. I mean, there's before that, Andrew Jackson. I mean, we could argue about what he represented, but certainly in, the Republicans and later the Democrats in the New Deal era, although those were complex coalitions, were much more serious candidates for what we need today to break through the kind of gridlock. I'll just add very briefly on the judges. In introducing that Steele Manning exercise, it was really just hypothetical, because I don't believe any of it. My own view is that judges, not just like leaving aside the radioactive history that Jake referred to, in our own time, they've set up presidential dictatorship. There's no more executive power forward precedent in the whole history of the country than Trump versus United States, even leaving the immunity protections aside. And more generally, when it comes to many powers of the president, like with regard to the unity of the executive branch, the Supreme Court has been a gift for Donald Trump that is going to keep on giving. And so the any radicalism you may see lower in the system will be blocked. Of course, there are going to be symbolic victories, like maybe on birthright citizenship, even at the highest levels of the Supreme Court, but that may have been a loss leader. And there's going to be a frightening amount of constitutional drift to the right, thanks to Trump driving it with the acquiescence and assent of the Supreme Court. So that is why this is the exact time to press our case. Not that there's, a place for judges. We may need to keep them in strict control. Rather that the only alternative is, a popular politics driving a movement party.
So one quick thing, Lisa, just a joke before I turn it to you is, in Federalist 51, Madison, ambition counteracting ambition. And you see a little bit John Roberts right now, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, lamenting, wow, our legitimacy is in tatters. Public hates us. President is just pushing against our rulings and disobeying judicial orders from the federal judiciary. We're all trying to find who did this, and he's in the hot dog suit like the meme. Lisa, go for it.
Thank you. I also am really, really enjoying these comments. And I just, in relation to what both Eric and Sam talked about with respect to the challenge of a transracial class-based, party, and the danger of long-term division along those lines. I think this is another way in which movements can create a lot of energy and education. I think, Eric, you mentioned the way that a lot of the unions today that were, with all the workers that were exposed to layoffs, are filing motions in court. But I think some of this might be seen as an adaptation right, to this incredibly complex, fragmented structure we have. Like if you think about the history, think about the Knights of Labor and the CIO and like all the way, I mean, they got quashed by every veto point, right? Like state level legislatures, governors, courts, and then they finally get some, you know, they start to get some momentum in Illinois, and then Grover Cleveland comes in, right, with the army, basically. So I think some of this is adaptation, and I think that kind of thing is really important to help people understand why things look the way they do, right? So you adapt by saying, okay, the American Federation of Labor says, okay, we're just gonna, you know, we're gonna target in these very narrow ways. And so it looks like Americans don't want, you know, cross racial class-based organizing. And I just think that's, inaccurate. So I just wanted to echo that point as
If you
well.
know, yeah, go for it.
The article with Eric Strickler is fantastic. The only thing I would say just for this, I think that the Senate does exhibit some of the backsliding. I think it's really the House that has been remarkably consistent relative to the others.
Apportioned by population. And I want to continue on this labor question. Last thing before we turn it over to audience Q&A. I want to turn it to Eric. Here's a steel-manned argument. So if people know my work, they know, you know, my latest publication, peer-reviewed, is, you know, quant analysis on labor, organized labor and democracy, voting rights. So I really believe labor, multiracial labor coalition is central, has incentives structurally, behaviorally, and institutionally to want to expand voting rights and produce political equality and majoritarianism. However, in recent years, here's the Steelman argument against this. The labor movement in recent years, the president of the Teamsters, Sean O'Brien, has spoke at the RNC that currently the structure of the labor movement is to pick off gains for a particular union or enterprise-based union, even at the expense of other workers. So on Sean Fain in recent UAW and support in part for Trump's economic agenda that could potentially benefit domestic auto workers at the expense of other sectors of workers in the U.S., as well as just the stagnation of private sector union vote wins in CERT elections in Bessemer, Alabama, and elsewhere. Despite really historic and survey research, this is the highest level of union support and approval we have on record. Despite all of this, we see also support for various forms of right-wing populism within the labor movement's rank and file. Eric, with this situation, how is labor positioned with respect to democratic institutions? How might that change?
Yeah. Yeah, I don't think that the argument is that the unions, just as they're currently oriented, are going to save us, because the unfortunate reality is that most unions, as I mentioned before, are oriented in a bad direction. And so part of that is the excessive legalism. Part of it is this very widespread transactional approach to politics, which frankly isn't particular to, you know, any of these unions, even on the right, even most unions' relation to the Democratic Party is also extremely transactional. It's like, how do I get this Democratic mayor to give this crumb to our members or not attack us quite as bad, which is why I see some unions endorsing Andrew Cuomo of all people. So this is just a very long-standing problem in the labor movement internationally that you're not going to resolve easily. Nevertheless, there's clear historic and contemporary precedent for unions acting in a different way, and so that requires transforming them and pushing in a more expansive direction. And so the argument is more about the potentialities of labor than the current orientation per se. But even from just like a macro long history sense, the labor movement in the US today is so much better on like these type of social justice issues and sort of inclusion as a general trend than it was 50 years ago and 100 years. There's no contest. Up until 2000, the labor movement's official position was against immigrants, coming into the US. That was the official position, so there's just been a tremendous shift. And so I think as far as the like basic equality issues, that's a big transformation. The bigger issue I just think is that the labor movement is very unused to articulating a political vision, or at least supporting a political vision that's getting articulated. Most unions didn't support Bernie. And the last time you can really look towards really like strongly articulated social democratic vision, you really have to go back to like the UAW of the 50s, maybe the 60s latest, but really the 30s where the CIO, and then some of the remnants of that. Most unions don't articulate that. They don't, even if they're somewhat militant on a like workshop basis, they don't either support politicians who articulate that alternative democratic vision, and so this is a huge issue. And I think that just speaks again to the question of transforming and pushing the unions in a different direction and not expecting that they'll do it on their own.
Excellent. I think this is all excellent stuff on the actual like pivotal issues of democracy and authoritarianism in the US right now. We have a great set of audience questions. The first one is anonymous. I'm reading it in two ways. There's two very good embedded questions in this one, but it's about the lack of a functioning progressive political party, which I take as coalitionally and institutionally, which has come up. And also underneath it, I didn't quite know, it may have been dysfunctional or a lack of functional progressive policy that has shown its effective sort of effects at improving people's material lives and things like that, that could lean towards like an abundance agenda style of question and Democratic Party coalitional politics and sort of institutional party management. I have a lot of thoughts about this, but I'd like to turn it over to my panelists first.
I'd like to respond. I'm a little bit in danger of, I have this checks and balances brain right now, so I'm a little bit in danger of, checks and balances is my hammer, and then everything looks like a nail. But I do think that actually in response to some of Eric's comments too, like some of this is adaptation, right? Why is it so hard to get progressive policy going? Well, it's really, really hard to get things done in this incredibly complicated, fragmented political system we have. And one of the things we know about collective action is if you don't get any wins, people give up. And if your goal is blocking, right, which is something the right's been doing for 50 years, right? Really, with increasing success, right? We're going to stop liberals from doing this. We're going to stop progressives. That's motivating. And so one problem is, and this is what I meant earlier when I said, part of a party vision moving forward has to say something about how they're going to overcome these fragmented structures. But like why should unions have to bargain by sector or by individual businesses or by local government, right, to get things like an increase in the minimum wage? Something just absolutely fundamental that appears absurd to democracies elsewhere in the world, to workers elsewhere in the world, right? So part of the reason I think we don't see a more effective progressive policy, more regular progressive policy, and then a kind of momentum of progressive policy is precisely because we live in a political structure that makes it much, much, much easier to block things than to get things done. And that's a hard, it's a bitter pill to swallow. But I don't see any way around.
I like that a bit. It also channeling old political scientist Juan Lin's on that. If you set up enough checks and balances so majorities never get what they want, they not only feel a lack of efficacy and sort of leave and don't follow politics and don't care and become apathetic, they also sometimes blow it all up.
You get a strong one.
Yeah, Sam and Eric.
Yeah, no, I mean, I love that in part because I think it's like a more sophisticated version of a point the abundance bros have been making, which is about the reigning legalism of the Democrats. The trouble is the conservatives have gotten a lot more juice out of legalism in the last 50 years, and they're equally kind of pursuing that kind of strategy. I do think it's true, like in a more abstract way, that the Democrats have suffered in part from a kind of strategy of damage control during a counter-revolutionary era. But it's I think I'm sorry to say that the syndrome is more insidious because it really is about partisan identity and the choice of Democrats over time to become an urban party that connects the very richest and the very poorest. And that has meant just not enough people in the party and risking a loss, or making the suburbs and exurbs battlegrounds, totally abandoning much of the country, and it's not just rural areas, and then producing policies that aren't about damage control, but that have been full-on neoliberal with a slight humanizing addition for the sake of those very poor constituents, but basically a rich person's party with some poor followers. And so that was a disastrous era which has nothing to do with process or legalism. It has to do with an ideological disaster of the first order. And many of us want to see that corrected, but the Democrats, right for the moment, are also leaderless in the face of this authoritarian threat. And some of these politicians will say nothing beyond resist tyranny, like you saw Gavin Newsom say yesterday or the day before. So we're in need of some kind of ideological jolt that's substantive, and I think the other problems can, in a sense, not solve themselves, but will be part of that jolt if and when it happens.
And if I may just quickly, I 100% agree with you, Sam. I think the Democrats drank the neoliberal Kool-Aid too. And that those are huge problems. But I guess I've been struck in just going through a lot of congressional bills introduced and party platforms. I've been struck by how many progressive ideas were around. They were floating around and they got no traction, partly understandably because of the deliberate choices that the Democratic Party made at the top, absolutely. But also partly because it's really hard to get it done. And at some point you give up. And I think the Affordable Care Act is a great example of this, by the way, right? Give up on attaching universal health care to the Social Security Act. Give up on, just making it universal. We're gonna do what we can. And, I don't blame people for that, but it recognizing that the part of the long-term effect of continually being vetoed is some kind of adaptation.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I do think, going back to the labor question, that the difficulties of passing progressive legislation, and then also just the very bizarre labor regime we have, which does push unions in a narrow direction. On the other hand, since the 30s, labor has been extremely focused on politics. Previous to that, it was very not oriented to politics, but since the 30s, it's been, oriented towards politics, and the Democratic Party in particular. And you can't really explain that the particular role of labor in relation to the Democrats primarily via just the checks and balances, because there's a lot of agencies there. There's the unions could, for instance, do what they did in the 30s, where the CIO did, which is have like a sort of a proto party within the Democratic Party, where they ran well, they don't always run their own candidates. They did sometimes at a local level, but they had their own basically mechanisms, kind of like DSA today, frankly, in which they were mobilizing their members on their own platforms, oftentimes in local third parties, or they took over the Democratic Party in some states and they functioned, in a sort of proto third party way, or with a New Deal type politics, working class social democratic politics. And they were able to put forward a vision in that way. And the defeat of that project, you can point to certain veto points and things like that, sure. But the fact that it's so rarely even tried is actually sort of a puzzle. I can agree with, that it succeeds too infrequently, sure. But the fact that it's so rarely tried suggests to me a deep level of institutional inertia and conservatism and risk aversion within the House of Labor, that right now you see some unions providing a different approach, like the UAW, I would suggest, is actually providing a different approach. For instance, is one of the very few unions to very vigorously be endorsing and mobilizing its members for Zoran Mamdani in New York City, in a way that most other unions were like very hesitant to support still, or at most they're ranking them third, and and it's not like an all-in approach. So I do think that there's some instances of unions moving in a different direction, but it's still actually, I would actually say it's still very puzzling given the authoritarian turn, given the Democrats being MIA, how little the unions have used their institutional might within the Democratic Party coalition to push for just like a basic social democratic vision, like not even a Bernie vision, but just something different. They were they're MIA as well.
Fascinating. I really like this. People teasing out what parts of elite Democratic Party behavior is based in ideological commitments to things versus various institutional or economic incentives they may have. And I would just say that I find that a useful framework for understanding this. And I've long, I study political parties. The Democratic Party has left a lot of money on the table when it comes to breaking norms to get gains, even for what you guys are calling the neoliberal Democratic Party agenda, or even just partisan gain over the levers of US governance. The Democratic Party, let the Republican Party erode a lot of norms around gerrymandering and voting rights in the 2010s that benefited the Republican Party. The use of the filibuster became asymmetric. And then more recently, we've seen this sort of deer in the headlights, especially from the Senate leadership, when it comes to institutional resistance, as well as, even less support for protests than in the Trump 1 era, such as party support for the Women's March. All of these forms of hedging do, like Eric says, with respect to the labor movement too, are a puzzle. Why would the Democratic Party, essentially the New York State Democratic Party, gerrymandered itself out of a U.S. House majority? Why would a party do that? One is that they don't want the majority, potentially. But another is that this is a geriatric gerontocracy party that is like actually believes in norms and values ideologically, not material. This was very hard for me as a materialist to come to this realization that there's an ideological commitment to an Aaron Sorkin-esque West Wing style of norms and politics that goes back, in many cases, these politicians have been in governance and politics since the 1970s and the textbook Congress. And my work, for example, with Adam Bonica shows that there's a really an old person coalition that supports with money in politics older candidates and really blocks in party management the decline of the working class Democratic Party candidate through primary elections, where it takes money to sort of clear the field early on to become a viable candidate in a primary, and that the really odd ones are like AOC that whip up canvassing power in a sleepy primary election is the true exception of a working class candidate. And that, speaking to Eric's point, in many cases, it was union stewards from locals who would rise up in the labor movement to then run for office, whereas currently the modal person running for office is in their late 50s and comes from private law. This is a massive shift in party management. It has institutional and economic reasons, but it also has this, I think, an ideological reason behind it. Would you guys like to jump in at this point? Or I can move us in another direction. We have about 4 more minutes, so I'd actually like us to think of everyone's sort of last, we had opening statements, everyone's closing statement. Maybe a what is to be done style question if you have that in the bag.
Well, I can go first just because my closing statement can follow directly on Jake's, because I'm just putting the finishing touches on my own gerontocracy book. And, first of all, for electoral gerontocracy, which is very real, we have to connect that to a materialist foundation, which is that the distribution of wealth, especially landed wealth, is also trending way old. And so when we're asking what older voters are doing, there's ideology and there's interest, but then there's a bigger comment, which is about that's kind of pervaded about something that's pervaded our discussion, which is it's wrong. Like, it's wrong to think of the distinction between material interests and ideology in a vulgar Marxist way, because ideology can reflect interests in really complicated fashions. Gramsci, whom Jake invoked, was a Marxist. He wasn't a culturalist trying to disregard the material foundation.
That was exactly why I threw
so I would say, if we're talking about the liberals today, and it's true, so many of the politicians are old. Well, they may be harboring long ago boomer ideology, but that ideology came from somewhere in its time. And, so there's just a complex, like, I think we have to introduce some complexity instead of saying, oh, well, it's either like direct class interests or culture, because these are connected. And so we need a kind of better way of talking about the way that they're connected in so many different distinct cases. And it's really hard to figure out how to talk about that.
Thank you, Sam. Let's turn to Eric and then Lisa.
Yeah, I'll be quick. All I would say is that one thing that I'm worried about is that the fact that Trump is taking the lead on breaking the institutional norms is going to make it harder for our side to do it when we need to do that. This is a big worry of mine, and it's going to give Democrats an excuse next time we're in office to say, well, we don't want to be the people threatening to pack the courts or to do this X, Y, Z. And so we need to like not let that become the new common sense. And I think the argument in response to this is Trump is responding to a real demand from below to have change. And if we don't seize that mantle, the far right will do that. But that's an argument we have to have right now. Or otherwise, we're going to be long in the minority and long in reaction.
That could have spawned a whole new webinar just on that question, Eric. Thank you. Lisa.
I agree. I mean, I think it's an irony here, that the Democrats, wrung their hands so much over the judicial, judge packing question, which I don't, I'm not saying it's a good idea, but I mean, it's interesting that, and then just Trump comes along and smashes everything. And, I agree. I think the only antidote to that really is mass movement that responds directly and it calls out how little responsiveness the current administration has, because it's not the priority, right? It's not the aim of the administration to help ordinary Americans. I really like Jake, your institutional, ideological / party economic distinction. I think that's really important. I think as Sam sort of alluded, they're really hard to tease out. I think ideas matter too, but I do think there are very few economic issues and very few ideas and ideological commitments that aren't filtered in one way or another through this exceptionally fragmented political structure. And I mean, the time doesn't permit a greater accounting of all of the fragmentation, but it is stunning. And so that doesn't mean that there are many other factors at play. And look, democratic erosion is happening in other places. So obviously the American political structure can't explain all of it. But as I say in the opening line to my soon to be finished writing book, and I have to make sure I get it right, if every democracy is unhappy, each democracy is unhappy in its own way. And we have to identify why our democracy is unhappy. And I think, being persistently mindful of the many ways in which mass publics are thwarted in getting basic public policy reform in the wake of economic change and social change is a really crucial one. And I'm really grateful for the fantastic comments and conversation here.
Me too. This is the 50th anniversary of the Boston Review. The forum is on the dead end of checks and balances with the lead article from Lisa Miller here. Thanks to Lisa, Sam Moyn, Eric Blanc, and Alex Gourevitch. Thanks so much for your time. USA.
Thanks, everyone.